is the fourth video about the socialization role of education. This video will look at changes in the 20th century. Now, the legal definition of what an Indian is contained in the Indian Act. It was later amended in 1951 to be, quote, a person who is pursuant to this act registered as an Indian or is entitled to register as an Indian, end quote. In general, such persons were those whose ancestors were defined as Indians at the time of the first Federal Act of 1868. They were also known as Aboriginals, as being defined in the Constitution as dwelling in any country before the arrival of the later European colonists. A few other terms that are sometimes used interchangeably are status Indian and treaty Indian. A status Indian is a person defined as an Indian by the Indian Act and has been registered as an Indian by having his or her name either on a banned list or a general list, and that gives them certain rights, restrictions, and benefits under the Indian Act. As I said, they're sometimes referred to as treaty Indians. In 1987, there was roughly 360,000 status Indians. By 2011, the number of registered or treaty Indians was 697,505 people, so almost doubled. In 1871, treaties were the signed documents between the Indian leaders and the federal government that designated reserve lands to be owned and occupied, and they tended to give hunting rights and a few minor allotments as well. So that started in 1871. The ownership of Indian reserves bestowed by the treaties had little to do with the status rights granted in the Indian Act. Many of the Indian bands were actually missed in the treaty signings, especially in British Columbia and Quebec. Therefore, these bands do not have designated reserves. So those are the non-treaty Indians that we sometimes hear about today. Now, registered Indians who have reserves can legally be called status treaty Indians. I am using the word Indians because that's how it's defined in the Indian Act. Now, many Native peoples in British Columbia and Quebec are legally recognized as status non-treaty Indians. Now, the terms do cause a lot of confusion among Native nations who interchange the terms treaty and status. There's also another term that's used is called enfranchised Indians or Native peoples. And those are the Native peoples who happened to be standing in line when the Indian agents came to count heads in the late 19th century. Others may have been away for various reasons and were never counted, and so their descendants have paid the price ever since. So in 1920, the Enfranchisement Amendment to the Indian Act was added, in which individuals, usually men, or sometimes entire bands, by a simple majority vote, could surrender. They could give up their status as Indians in return for the federal vote and becoming Canadian citizens. Now, if a man voluntarily, quote unquote, gave up his status, his wife and children were also automatically disenfranchised. And now it's important to note that this was often done using that sort of good old boy coercion method. So the Indian agent might come calling on the family, bringing liquor. He'd sit with his quote unquote Indian friend, get him drunk, and have him sign on the dotted line. And once they did, the family was often kicked off the reserve within days. As you know, women who married non-Indigenous men and any children that came from that marriage also lost their status. These women were allowed to apply for reenfranchisement through the passing of Bill C-31 in 1985, which was an amendment to the Indian Act. Bill C-31 gave all first-generation children of these marriages and natives who were not counted and who now wish to regain status the right to reapply. Men who had married non-native women could keep their status, and their white wives, in turn, were automatically granted Indian status, as were their children. The Assembly of First Nations is an organization that you might have heard of, and it's an organization of First Nations leaders, government leaders under a national chief, and the structure was formalized under the Charter of the Assembly of First Nations, which was adopted in July of 1985. Now, if you remember, in 1919, Duncan Campbell Scott, who had been against compulsory education, changed his mind. And he felt it was impossible for the system to succeed, the education system to succeed, just using voluntary means. So in 1920, an amendment to the Indian Act made it mandatory for every child between the ages of 7 and 15 to attend school. Enforcement was set out in Section 10 and included things like truant officers and penalties, fines, imprisonment for noncompliance, and so on. And it's not until 1969 that the Department of Indian Affairs took over sole management of the schools and ended the partnership with the churches. So the churches helped to run the schools until 1969, at which time the government took over completely. Unfortunately, this change did not improve the schools at all. They remained chronically underfunded, and conditions remained well below the standards that had been set by the department itself. The pattern of abuse was not affected by the regulations on punishment introduced after World War II, and physical abuse continued until the last schools were closed in 1996. The Department of Indian Affairs and the churches also had been long aware that the regimented system of discipline in the schools left the children, abused or not, unfit for life either in the native or non-native communities. So the schools ended up producing thousands of individuals who were incapable of leading healthy lives or contributing positively to their communities. This map is hard to read, but I wanted to show it to you because it gives a sense of where the different schools were located and generally which church ran them. So if you look at this, you can see that the schools in red print were run by the Catholic Church. You can see them scattered across the country. Anglican were the blue words there. Green is the United Church. Presbyterian are the light blue. They're going to be a little harder to see. Baptist and Mennonite are also there. There's fewer of them, so they'll be harder to pick out, as well as non-denominational churches. So as you can see, the most frequent ones are the Roman Catholic, the Anglican, and the United Church. As of 1931, there were 44 Roman Catholic-run residential schools, 21 Church of England or Anglican schools, 13 United Church schools, and 2 Presbyterian. That's a picture there of Shubenacadie School in 1930, which was, I believe, if I remember correctly, it's out in the East Coast. A little bit more of a timeline. In 1968, the National Indian Brotherhood was formed. They became a quite activistic organization that did a lot of protesting. 1969 there was the Federal White Paper, which is an important document in the history of Indigenous white relations. The Federal White Paper recommended the elimination of all legal discrimination, the abolition of the Department of Indian Affairs, and the integration of Native peoples into dominant society. Now, the federal government was formally ending the partnerships with the religious organizations for the residential schools. And then in 1972, Native opposition to the White Paper resulted in the National Indian Brotherhood calling for Native control of Native education. And it's been a long fight since then. In 1973, the federal government withdrew the White Paper and accepts the principle of Native control of Native education. In 1976, the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College is created at the University of Regina. And then in 2003, that college becomes the First Nations University of Canada, which is in Regina. And we have the 1980s. Most of the last residential schools closed. and ban control of schooling begins to increase in British Columbia and elsewhere across Canada. 1996 is the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and also when the last residential school closed. Now, it's important to note that some aspects of this type of chronology differs based on which Indigenous group you're talking about and which province you're talking about. I have just a few little notes on some of the national findings and recommendations, just to give you a sense of the fact of how many reports have come out over the years, and there's still problems with the way things are run. Central to the process of political self-determination is control over education. The key to the future of any society is the ability to transmit its culture and worldview to its succeeding generations. So education's role in the socialization of children shapes all aspects of identity. It helps to instill knowledge of the society's language, history, traditions, behavior, and spiritual beliefs. So control over education is a primary concern for Native peoples. You can see here there's the Special Committee on the Executive Council of the National Indian Brotherhood in Yellowknife Northwest Territories in 1972 that's advocating for Indian control of Indian education. In 1988, there's the National Review by the Assembly of First Nations about the vision for a future of Indigenous education. And then 1991, the Assembly of First Nations motion about the First Nations' right to decide their own education, and so on. 1996, we have the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that talks about education being a core element in Aboriginal self-government. That's right in around here. And then it also talks about First Nations being able to create education authorities for the purpose of establishing policies on goals, standards, administering community schools, and so on. And so the push for Indigenous control of education continues. 2002, the National Working Group on Education, called Our Children Keepers of the Sacred Knowledge, also again recommends jurisdiction over education, as well as the role of the what used to be Indigenous affairs, and then there's also the role of the provinces and territories as outlined here. There were a couple readings for this week. The article by Mosby is one that made the news the year it was published, so in 2013, so a few years ago. When it was published, it actually was literally reported in the newspapers, which is something that rarely happens with historical articles. And the reason it made the news is because Mosby's research revealed that Aboriginal children in Canada were used for real experiments. And so it was quite shocking when that came out. In the Carr, Stewart, and Steves 2009 article, the authors argue that the federal system of education for First Nations children has only a very surface similarity with the provincial systems for all the other children in the provinces. They say that the fractured federal approach to First Nations education, the lack of a governance system, educational policy, limited second-level services and funding inequities, and so on, all contributes to educational services that are different from other children and inhibits First Nation students learning and effective educational outcomes. And so this article is an analysis of First Nations education policy. The optional chapters by Risby and Lingard pick up the question of how education policy changes with increasing mobility of children or of people, such as responses to increased cultural diversity and so on. One last thing I want to mention is the importance of language. So one of the things you can think about is, why is language important? And why is there such a strong effort today to retrieve and recreate Indigenous languages? Jeanette Armstrong, who is an Okanagan Native writer and educator from Penticton, BC, says, quote, "It took a long time for me to realize the value of having a grandmother who could speak to me in the total purity of our language. The total purity of the words which have been handed down through thousands of years, from mind to mind, from mouth to mouth, encompassing actions generated for I don't know how long, thousands and thousands of years. I was given an understanding of how a culture is determined, how culture is passed on. It is through words, it is through the ability to communicate to another person, to communicate to your children the thinking of your people in the past, their history, that you are a people. Before the 20th century, most church missionary bodies actually did not agree with the government's desire for a complete ban on the use of native languages. In the 1850s, the government of the province of Canada had insisted that the Jesuits stop permitting the use of Ojibwe at their mission and schools on Manitoulin Island. During the period of federally supported residential schooling after 1883, government officials applied heavy pressure on school administrators to force the use of English or French in parts of Quebec. In 1894, there's an annual report of the Department of Indian Affairs that says, quote, every effort must be made to induce pupils to speak English and to teach them to understand it. Unless they do, the whole work of the teacher is likely to be wasted, end quote. And so over time, even though the missionaries initially were okay with using Indigenous language, bureaucratic attitudes and missionary attitudes on language start to become more similar. And finally, I have this poem called I Lost My Talk by Rita Joe that says, I lost my talk, the talk you took away, when I was a little girl at Shibanakadi school. You snatched it away. I speak like you. I think like you. I create like you. The scrabbled ballad about my world. Two ways I talk, both ways I say. Your way is more powerful. So gently I offer my hand and ask, let me find my talk so I can teach you about me. And she was a survivor of the residential school system. So the reflection question is, how has the socialization role for schools changed or not changed over the last 150 years or so? The case we've talked about here is about Indigenous education, but we can think about it for other groups as well. So this concludes the 4 videos for this week's class. Thank you.